The whole town used to laugh at Griffin Cole for clinging to a tiny airfield with one cracked runway, a handful of yellow lights, and a hangar that groaned every time the wind picked up. When the powerful young executive Sloan Whitmore ordered the place shut down, everyone assumed Griffin had finally lost. They called him the single father who guarded a pile of scrap metal in a world that had moved on to private jets and glass towers. But on a black, storm-soaked midnight, a Mayday call tore through the static, and the woman who had padlocked that runway found herself begging the same man she once dismissed to turn the lights back on. If stories about quiet people holding on to something worth more than money keep you hooked until the very end, go ahead and hit subscribe so the next one finds you. Cedar Hollow sat in a fold of the Montana mountains where the wind never seemed to stop, and the winters arrived early and stayed late, and every morning before the sun cleared the ridge, Griffin Cole walked the length of his runway with a flashlight in one hand and a notebook in the other, checking the edge lights, brushing frost from the windsock, and writing down the direction of the air the way his father had taught him 30 years earlier. The airfield he tended was small by any measure that mattered to the world beyond the valley, just a single strip of asphalt patched more times than anyone could count, a low radio shack with peeling paint, and 3 aging aircraft that belonged to men who still trusted Griffin more than any mechanic in the county. To the people of Cedar Hollow, the place was a relic, something left over from a decade nobody talked about anymore, a stubborn square of pavement that a stubborn man refused to let go of. They said he should sell the land, take whatever a buyer offered, and find honest work that didn't involve scraping rust off a fuel pump for a living. At the diner on Main Street, a few of the regulars had taken to calling him the king of a dead runway, laughing into their coffee whenever they saw him hauling a bucket of paint out to redraw the center line under a punishing summer sun. What none of them understood, because none of them had ever needed to understand it, was that Griffin did not walk that runway out of sentiment. He walked it because he had spent enough hours in bad weather to know that a single loose bolt or a single burned-out light could be the difference between a pilot finding solid ground and a pilot finding nothing at all. He kept the surface clean, the lights working, and the radio always warm because somewhere out past the ridge, on a night nobody could predict, someone might need exactly what Cedar Hollow Airfield had to offer. At the edge of the property stood a faded wooden sign his father had planted years before, the paint chipped, but the words still legible, reading Cedar Hollow Airfield, open for emergency use, and some mornings Griffin would stop in front of it, rest his palm flat against the letters, and stand there a moment longer than the task required, as if the sign itself were a promise he had no intention of breaking. Griffin's days followed a rhythm few outsiders would have recognized as work at all, beginning long before dawn with a walk along the fence line to check for deer that sometimes wandered onto the strip overnight, continuing through a slow inspection of the fuel pump, the windsock cable, and the small weather station he had built with parts, salvaged from 3 different decades of equipment. He answered to no supervisor and reported to no company, yet he moved through each task with the discipline of someone who understood that a single overlooked detail could cost a life he would never even meet. In the afternoons, he taught basic flight lessons to a handful of local students, patient with their mistakes in a way that surprised people who assumed a man so quiet must also be a man without warmth. And in the evenings, he sat with Mara at the kitchen table, helping her with homework, while the radio in the next room murmured weather reports from stations 2 counties away. Neighbors sometimes wondered aloud why he never remarried, why he never sold the land and moved somewhere the winters were gentler, why he never once complained about carrying an entire airfield on his own shoulders. And the honest answer, one he rarely spoke aloud, was that the airfield had never felt like a burden to him, only a responsibility passed down through blood and expectation. He had grown up watching his father greet stranded pilots with coffee and dry blankets, had grown up understanding that some places existed not to turn a profit but to be there when nothing else was, and that inheritance had settled into him so completely that he no longer separated the man from the mission. When townspeople laughed at him, he never argued the point, because arguing would have required explaining a truth that people who had never needed rescuing were unlikely to believe until the night they needed it most. Sloan Whitmore arrived in Cedar Hollow the way storms arrive in places that have never seen one, with a line of black vehicles, a team of lawyers, a cluster of engineers carrying tablets full of projections, and a local reporter trotting to keep pace with her stride. She had come to survey the land for a project called Whitmore Skygate Logistics, an aviation and freight hub valued at more than $2 billion. The kind of development that could reshape an entire region's economy in a single signature. To Sloan, Griffin's little airfield was an obstacle sitting exactly where her surveyors needed clear ground, a patch too small to serve her ambitions, but positioned squarely inside the parcel her company intended to consolidate. Her board wanted the airfield closed, the land purchased, and the strip repurposed as a secondary gate for the larger facility rising around it. At the town hall meeting that followed, Sloan spoke in the polished language of progress, promising new jobs, new roads, and a future Cedar Hollow had never dared to imagine for itself, and the crowd applauded because they believed her company would finally put their town on a map that mattered. Griffin stood among them and rose to object, explaining that the airfield was not merely his family's property, but the only certified emergency landing point for many miles when the weather turned dangerous, a fact the county had recorded decades earlier and never formally revoked. Sloan listened, or appeared to, though what she heard was a man defending his own attachment to the past rather than a warning about the mountains he had spent his life studying. Daphne Ellison, the company's chief counsel, stepped forward with a folder of documents arguing that the airfield no longer met the threshold of regular commercial activity required to keep its local operating status, and Conrad Whitmore, watching from the back of the room with the folded arms of a man who had never lost an argument in his life, added that small places eventually had to make room for larger futures. The crowd turned toward Griffin the way crowds turn toward the losing side of any contest, and one contractor even joked, loud enough for half the room to hear, that perhaps the runway would make a fine parking lot. Griffin did not raise his voice. He simply said that an airfield did not need to be busy to be important, it only needed to be ready at the right moment. And then he sat back down while Sloan gathered her papers and walked out without giving the sentence a second thought. Afterward, in the parking lot outside the town hall, a cluster of neighbors surrounded Griffin with the kind of sympathy that stung worse than outright ridicule, telling him he had made his point and could now step aside with his conscience clear, since no one expected a mechanic with grease under his fingernails to hold ground against a corporation with lawyers in every state capital. One man patted his shoulder and said he admired the effort, the way people admire effort in a race already decided, and a woman who ran the general store suggested he consider a settlement before the company decided to stop being generous at all. Griffin thanked them for their concern with the same even tone he used for everything else, offering no promises and no protests, because he had learned long ago that explaining himself to people who had never flown through weather like that would only waste breath better spent checking a fuel line. Driving home that night, he passed the turnoff to the airfield and slowed, the way he always did, studying the dark tree line for any early sign of the season's first real storm, and found himself thinking not about Sloan Whitmore or her billion-dollar logistics hub, but about the folder in his filing cabinet, the one containing the original county designation his father had fought to secure decades earlier. He had never needed that folder before. Something in the set of Sloane's jaw during the meeting told him he might need it soon. A few weeks later, the shutdown order reached Griffin through the county office, pushed forward by Whitmore Vantage Group's legal team with the kind of efficiency that made the outcome feel inevitable before it even arrived. He was instructed to remove the sign, disconnect the runway lighting, lock the radio station, and refuse any aircraft that attempted to land without special written approval from the company now overseeing the land dispute. The closure itself happened in full view of the town, with a crew from Whitmore erecting a temporary barrier across the entrance, while the local paper photographed Griffin standing motionless beside the runway, his expression unreadable, his hands empty at his sides. The headline the following morning read that the last small airfield had finally made way for the future, and beneath it a photograph showed the barrier gate glinting in the afternoon light like a verdict already rendered. People kept laughing, though the laughter had grown a little quieter, a little more like pity than mockery, as neighbors told him he had picked the wrong opponent, that no single father with a wrench in his hand could ever outlast a family like the Whitmores. Someone at the hardware store suggested he sell his tools and take up work fixing cars instead, since cars, unlike airplanes, would never need him again in the middle of a storm. Sloane never mocked him directly, but her silence cut deeper than any joke could have, and it was followed by a formal offer to buy the land at a price well below its worth, accompanied by a note describing it as his last chance to leave with dignity intact. Griffin refused the offer without hesitation, and though he could no longer legally open the field to commercial traffic, he kept tending it anyway, patching the generator by day and testing the radio equipment after dark, as though some part of him refused to accept that the closure was permanent. When his daughter Mara asked why he still cared for a place the world had already written off, he told her that some things stopped being recognized long before they stopped being necessary, and that readiness did not require anyone's permission. Near the end of that stretch, one of the project workers snapped a photograph of Griffin replacing a runway light in the fading evening sun, and the image circulated with a caption mocking him for still believing an airplane would ever return to that empty strip of asphalt. Griffin saw the photograph eventually, shown to him by a well-meaning neighbor who thought he deserved to know what people were saying, and he studied it for a long moment before handing the phone back without any visible reaction. He understood, better than most, that ridicule was simply the sound made when they could not imagine a use for something they had never needed themselves, and he had absorbed enough of it over the years to stop expecting it to feel any different. That evening he sat with Mara on the porch steps, the barricade at the airfield entrance barely visible through the trees, and she asked him, in the direct way children ask the questions adults spend their whole lives avoiding, whether he was scared they would take the land away from him entirely. He told her the land was hers as much as his, that it had been her grandfather's before either of them existed, and that some things were worth protecting even when the whole world seemed convinced they no longer mattered. He did not tell her about the storm advisories he had already begun tracking more closely than usual, or about the quiet unease that had settled into him the moment he first heard the name Skygate Logistics, sensing somehow that a project built on that scale would eventually collide with weather it could not outplan or outspend. At the Whitmore Vantage headquarters in Denver, Sloane faced pressures that ran far deeper than the disagreement in a small mountain town. The Skygate Logistics project was not simply another line item on a balance sheet. It was her proof to her father and to the entire board that she could carry the family name into an era defined by scale and speed rather than legacy alone. But the project had begun to strain under its own weight, costs climbing faster than projected, environmental permits contested by unexpected parties, and shareholders growing uneasy about a timeline that kept slipping further out of reach. Preston Lockridge appeared during this period with practiced warmth, offering additional capital to stabilize the project, though his offer came wrapped around a condition that would hand him significant control over the aviation division. Sloane had spent years building. She distrusted him instinctively, sensing that his true goal was to fold Whitmore's aviation assets into his own company, Lockridge Aviation Holdings, and reduce her influence to a formality. Yet under her father's growing impatience, the board began treating Preston's proposal as a safe harbor rather than the trap Sloane believed it to be. During one particularly tense meeting, Preston remarked with a thin smile that perhaps Sloane had spent so much energy clearing away small airfields that she had forgotten how to protect the larger routes that actually mattered. A remark that stung precisely because she had no immediate answer for it. Meanwhile, her chief pilot, Reese Callahan, was reviewing regional flight charts and noticed something unusual about the coordinates surrounding Cedar Hollow, that the airfield recently closed by his own company sat in a position uniquely suited to the mountain winds that swept through the valley after nightfall, well outside the turbulence patterns that plagued the larger airports nearby. Reese raised his concerns directly with Sloane, suggesting that closing Cedar Hollow may have been a mistake with consequences no one had fully considered. But she waved the concern aside, certain that a strip of pavement so small could never matter to a company operating on the scale hers did. That same evening, the Regional Weather Service issued an advisory for a significant storm system building over the northern range, and despite it, Sloane boarded her private aircraft for a night flight to Seattle, determined to meet with investors before their confidence slipped away entirely. Before the aircraft departed, Reese made one final attempt to change her mind, laying a printed chart across her desk that showed Cedar Hollow's position relative to every certified landing site within 200 miles, circling the valley in red ink and reminding her that mountain storms in that range had a documented history of closing larger airports within minutes rather than hours. Sloane glanced at the chart the way she glanced at most warnings that arrived too close to a deadline, acknowledging it without truly absorbing it, her mind already occupied with the talking points she intended to deliver to investors who had grown tired of hearing promises instead of results. She told Reese that contingency planning was exactly what backup airports were designed for, and that a decommissioned strip belonging to a single mechanic in Cedar Hollow had no bearing on a flight plan built around far larger, far better equipped facilities. Reese folded the chart without further argument, recognizing the particular stubbornness that ran through every Whitmore he had ever flown for, and retreated to the cockpit to begin his pre-flight checks with a quiet unease he chose not to share with his co-pilot. Daphne, meanwhile, reviewed a final round of contract language on her tablet, more concerned with the wording of an environmental waiver than with the weather system building over the exact route they intended to fly. Conrad boarded last, remarking to no one in particular that turbulence had never once altered the outcome of a deal his family had set its mind to closing, a sentiment that would return to haunt him before the night was finished. To understand why Griffin refused to abandon that runway, it helped to understand the years that shaped him long before Sloane Whitmore ever set foot in Cedar Hollow. He had once flown emergency rescue missions across the same mountain range, ferrying doctors, medical equipment, and stranded travelers through conditions that grounded almost every other pilot in the region. And in those years, he learned exactly how much a small, well-kept airstrip in the middle of nowhere could mean to someone with nowhere else to turn. To wealthy developers, land like that looked empty and wasted, but to anyone who had ever flown through a blackout storm, searching for a strip of lights below the clouds, it could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. His father, Wade Cole had built Cedar Hollow Airfield decades earlier after a brutal winter storm left a small aircraft with nowhere safe to put down. And Wade had believed ever since that every mountain region needed at least one runway a pilot could find in complete darkness when every other option had closed. After Griffin's wife passed away following a long illness, he stepped back from rescue flying to raise Mara and to keep his father's promise alive, not because he wanted to be remembered as a hero, but because someone needed to keep the lights burning, and he happened to be the one still standing there. Inside the weathered hangar, Griffin maintained a system few outsiders ever noticed, an independent generator wired to survive outages, runway lighting quietly upgraded over the years despite its aging appearance, a backup radio unit tuned to emergency frequencies, a hand-operated wind gauge he trusted more than any digital equivalent, a small reserve of emergency fuel, and an approach map he updated by hand every season based on his own observations. None of the townspeople knew any of this, because all they ever saw was an old strip of pavement, never the hundreds of quiet hours Griffin spent keeping every piece of it ready for a moment that might never come. He also kept a thick folder of documentation proving that Cedar Hollow Airfield had once been formally registered as a community emergency landing site, protected under a clause that applied whenever no equivalent replacement existed nearby, a detail that would later matter far more than anyone in that boardroom could have guessed. On the night the storm advisory came through, Griffin heard the warning on his old radio, stepped to the hangar door, and studied the darkening sky above the ridge, then walked back inside and checked his generator one final time, even though the airfield remained officially closed. Sloan boarded her private aircraft that evening alongside her father, Conrad Whitmore, Chief Counsel Daphne Ellison, and a small team of advisors, all of them racing against the clock to reach Seattle before their most important investors lost patience with Skygate Logistics entirely. The mood on board was tense from the moment the wheels left the ground, with Conrad blaming his daughter for letting the project drift into uncertain territory, and Daphne suggesting that sacrificing a few smaller assets might be worth preserving the larger structure of the deal. Sloan said little, still convinced, in some quiet corner of her mind, that she remained fully in control of the situation despite everything closing in around her. In the cockpit, Reese Callahan and his co-pilot guided the aircraft through increasingly rough air as the storm intensified faster than forecasters had predicted, thick clouds swallowing the horizon, wind shifting without warning, and electrical interference beginning to crackle through their instruments. The larger airport ahead of them had already closed one of its runways after a lightning strike disabled a portion of its support systems, and the backup airport beyond it sat too far away to reach safely given their dwindling fuel reserves if they attempted to circle the storm any longer. At first, the situation remained within the range of ordinary difficulty, the kind of turbulence experienced pilots handled without alarm, but a secondary electrical fault soon appeared, causing part of their navigation equipment to behave unpredictably, and the margin for error began shrinking with every passing minute. Reese studied the chart in front of him and found Cedar Hollow Airfield exactly where he remembered it, and though he knew the strip had been closed by his own employer's decision, he also knew it remained the single location best aligned with the wind pattern battering them from every direction. He turned to Sloan and told her plainly that Cedar Hollow was their best option, and Daphne, her voice tightening, reminded everyone in the cabin that their own company had been the one to shut it down. In that instant, Sloan remembered Griffin standing in the town hall months earlier, calm and unshaken, telling her that a runway did not need to be busy, it only needed to arrive at the right moment, and before she could fully process the memory, the cockpit issued its distress call, the word Mayday cutting through the static as rain hammered against the fuselage and the name Cedar Hollow Airfield rose into the storm. Sloane had no choice but to call Griffin directly, and at first she tried to hold on to the authority she had built her entire identity around, instructing him to reactivate the airfield as though issuing a routine directive to an employee. Griffin listened to her voice through the crackle of the phone line, calm to the point of coldness, and reminded her that the airfield had been closed at her own company's insistence, its gate barricaded, its sign removed, its lights forbidden from operating for any commercial purpose without written approval that no longer existed. For a few seconds, Sloane said nothing, and for perhaps the first time in her adult life, she could not simply command her way out of a problem. She told him she needed him to open it again, and he answered with a question that landed harder than any accusation could have, asking her plainly whether she needed his land or whether she needed his runway. The question struck at something Sloane had never examined in herself, and with the rain intensifying and Reese warning that their remaining time was measured in minutes rather than hours, Conrad watched his daughter with none of his usual composure. Finally, Sloane spoke without any trace of her corporate posture, admitting that she had been wrong, that she needed his help not because she was a Whitmore, but because there were people on that aircraft who needed somewhere safe to land. Griffin did not use the moment to punish her further. He told Mara to stay inside the house, then ran out into the storm toward the hangar, flipping the breaker on the backup generator, unlocking the control cabinet, activating the edge lighting along the runway, checking the wind by hand, clearing a few small obstacles from the surface, and opening contact with Reese on the emergency frequency his father had insisted on maintaining decades earlier. It was a tense scene built entirely from focus and urgency rather than violence. One man alone in the driving rain, throwing switches one after another until a line of yellow lights blinked to life along a runway the entire town believed had died months before. High above, through the black and churning sky, Reese finally saw the lights of Cedar Hollow appear like a single thread offering the aircraft a way out of the storm. Inside the small control room, Griffin stood soaked to the skin, one hand pressed against the radio microphone, guiding Reese through every detail that mattered: the direction of the surface wind, the current condition of the runway, the usable length remaining, and the safest point to bring the wheels down given the crosswind sweeping in from the west. In the cabin above, Sloane sat without any of the composure that usually defined her, listening through the intercom as the same man she once viewed as an obstacle became the only steady voice guiding her aircraft through the darkness. Reese executed a visual approach in difficult conditions, rain streaking across the windshield, the runway lights fading in and out as gusts pushed against the fuselage, while Griffin instructed him to hold his altitude, avoid the wind shear rolling off the tree line to the west, and aim for a touchdown point just beyond the second marker he had painted himself years earlier. The aircraft struck the runway hard but controlled, the brakes shrieking against wet pavement, the lights trembling through the rain, and then a silence settled over the scene that felt heavier than the storm itself once the aircraft finally rolled to a stop. The door opened, and Sloane stepped down into the rain, finding Griffin standing beneath the hangar light, offering no smugness, no demand for an apology, no desire to see her humbled any further than the night already had. It was that very stillness that embarrassed her more deeply than any harsh word could have. Conrad Whitmore, the same man who once called this airfield useless in front of an entire town, looked down the length of the runway that had just saved his life and found himself with nothing to say. Griffin simply told them, in a voice free of triumph, that they were welcome to Cedar Hollow Airfield, the very place they had ordered closed. Once the immediate danger had passed, Sloane assumed the matter would end quietly, but Griffin understood that the real truth still needed to come into the light. Daphne attempted to manage the situation smoothly, suggesting that Whitmore Vantage would offer reasonable compensation for the inconvenience. But Griffin produced the folder he had prepared long before that night. Documents proving that Cedar Hollow Airfield had once been formally designated a community emergency landing site, protected by a clause that activated whenever the surrounding region lacked an equivalent alternative. Daphne fell silent as the implications settled over her, since forcing the closure of a protected emergency facility without providing a comparable replacement could expose Skygate Logistics to serious regulatory delays and an uncomfortable investigation into how the decision had been made in the first place. Griffin also presented evidence suggesting that a consulting group connected to Preston Lockridge had deliberately understated the airfield's strategic importance, feeding Sloan analysis that convinced her the site carried no meaningful value at all. Reese confirmed in front of everyone present that without Cedar Hollow, their flight that night would almost certainly have ended in tragedy, and he made it unmistakably clear that Griffin's airfield was not some forgotten antique, but essential emergency infrastructure hiding in plain sight. Sloan realized, standing there in the rain-soaked morning light, that she had not simply underestimated one stubborn man. She had allowed a rival to manipulate her into dismantling something that could have saved her own company from disaster. Griffin laid out his terms without raising his voice, explaining that he had no interest in selling the airfield under any circumstance, and that if Whitmore intended to continue its project, the company would need to restore Cedar Hollow Airfield as a certified emergency and mountain flight training center, preserve his independent authority to operate it, and issue a public apology to the town that had spent months mocking him for refusing to give it up. The following morning, Sloan brought Griffin into an emergency session with the full Whitmore Vantage board, and the contrast in that glass-walled room could not have been sharper. Griffin, still dressed in his weathered flight jacket, mud clinging to his boots, walking past executives who had once dismissed him as the keeper of a dead runway. Conrad wanted to resolve everything with money, offering to purchase the airfield outright and reduce Griffin to a symbolic employee. But Griffin refused outright, explaining that he had not come there to be bought. He had come there to protect a runway that had just proven its worth beyond any argument they could raise. Preston Lockridge joined the meeting remotely, feigning concern for Sloan's safety, but the moment Griffin presented his data, his wind charts, his legal documentation, and the connections tying the flawed consulting analysis back to Lockridge Aviation Holdings, Preston's practiced smile disappeared from the screen entirely. For the first time, Sloan stood beside Griffin in front of the board rather than against him, admitting openly that the decision to close the airfield had been a mistake born of arrogance and poor judgment. She told the room, in a voice that silenced every objection before it could form, that the Whitmore empire had not survived that storm because of its money or its influence. It had survived because of a man the company had spent months treating with contempt. The board, faced with the weight of evidence and the very real threat of regulatory exposure, approved a revised agreement restoring Cedar Hollow Airfield, preserving Griffin's operational control, and committing Whitmore funding to necessary upgrades without ever placing the company in charge of what the airfield actually represented. It was, in every sense that mattered, a complete reversal. The man once pushed away from the negotiating table, now the one holding the terms everyone else had to accept. One board member, an older woman named Eleanor Voss, who had sat on the Whitmore board since before Sloan was born, asked Griffin directly why he had waited until the night of the storm to reveal the emergency designation folder, rather than presenting it during the original town hall dispute months earlier. Griffin answered that he had tried to explain the airfield's purpose in plain language that evening and had watched the room decide. Before he even finished speaking, that a man in a worn jacket could not possibly know something a team of lawyers had missed. He said he kept the documentation ready not as a weapon to use against anyone, but because his father had taught him that proof mattered more than persuasion when dealing with people who measured worth only in numbers on a page. Conrad Whitmore, silent for most of the session, finally spoke, admitting in a voice stripped of its usual command that he had spent his career teaching his daughter to treat small operations as obstacles rather than assets, and that the lesson had nearly cost the family everything in a single stormy night. Sloane looked at her father for a long moment, something passing between them that had nothing to do with contracts or shareholders, before the room moved on to finalize the language of the agreement. By the time the meeting adjourned, the papers on the table no longer resembled the ones Daphne had drafted that morning, rewritten instead around a simple principle neither the board nor the Whitmore name had ever been forced to accommodate before. News of what happened that night spread quickly through Cedar Hollow, and the same people who had once laughed at Griffin now gathered near the airfield entrance with none of their earlier mockery left in their voices. The diner that used to call him the king of a dead runway now played the regional broadcast describing how he had personally guided a stranded aircraft safely out of a life-threatening storm. A handful of neighbors apologized directly, while others simply grew quiet out of embarrassment, and Griffin, true to his nature, made no effort to humiliate anyone in return, choosing instead to continue his routine exactly as he always had, checking the lights, recording the wind, wiping down the windows of his small control room. Sloane organized a public statement at Cedar Hollow Airfield itself, and rather than treating Griffin as a convenient public relations opportunity, she openly acknowledged that her company had underestimated the airfield, underestimated the man who maintained it, and underestimated how much small infrastructure in remote places could matter when the larger systems failed. Preston Lockridge soon came under investigation for manipulating the consulting reports that had influenced Sloane's original decision. And while the Skygate logistics project continued moving forward, its design was revised to protect Cedar Hollow permanently as both a safety landing site and a mountain flight training facility. The investigation into Lockridge Aviation Holdings widened faster than Preston anticipated. Regulators uncovering a pattern of understated assessments stretching back years, applied not only to Cedar Hollow but to several other small regional airfields, Preston had hoped to fold quietly into his own growing empire once their communities lost the will to defend them. Sloane provided investigators with the full record Griffin had assembled, unwilling to let a single detail of the manipulation disappear into a settlement negotiated behind closed doors. And for the first time in years she found herself more interested in exposing a wrong than in protecting her family's reputation from the embarrassment of admitting one had occurred. Conrad, watching the fallout from a distance, remarked privately to his daughter that he had spent decades building an empire on the assumption that scale alone guaranteed survival, and that the events at Cedar Hollow had forced him to reconsider a lesson he thought he had learned long ago. Sloane did not gloat over her father's admission, choosing instead to simply nod and return to the work of rebuilding what her company had so carelessly torn down. Near the end of that gathering, Mara stood a short distance away, watching her father from beneath the hangar's overhang as the crowd applauded, and Griffin offered only a small, quiet smile, since fame had never been what he wanted from any of it. For him, the sight of those runway lights burning steadily once again was already more than enough. Months later, Cedar Hollow Airfield no longer resembled the forgotten strip everyone had written off. Its runway resurfaced just enough to remain safe without losing its character, its hangar repaired, its radio equipment modernized, though the old wooden sign remained exactly where it had always stood, still reading Cedar Hollow Airfield, open for emergency use. Sloane returned one quiet afternoon without the usual convoy of vehicles trailing behind her, finding Griffin repainting the centerline himself just as he had done every summer of his adult life. She told him that Whitmore had built its influence by acquiring things that were large, but that the night of the storm had taught her that some of the smallest things could never truly be replaced. Griffin did not answer immediately, letting his gaze settle on the runway that had once been barricaded, once been mocked, once been dismissed by an entire town as nothing more than a stretch of aging pavement. Then he told her, in the same steady tone he had used the night her aircraft came down through the storm, that a runway never needed to be the longest one in the sky, it only needed to be there on the one night the sky ran out of other choices. Sloane considered his words for a long moment, then admitted that her company had spent years measuring value in square footage and projected revenue, never once accounting for the quiet kind of readiness that could not be bought at any price. She told him that the board had asked her, more than once, why Whitmore continued funding upgrades to a facility that would likely never again see a crisis on the scale of that storm, and that her answer, each time, had been the same, that some investments existed not to be used constantly, but to be trusted completely. Griffin nodded, understanding the sentiment better than anyone she could have explained it to, since he had spent his entire life maintaining exactly that kind of trust for a town that rarely thought to thank him for it. The final scene unfolded in the quiet stillness of early evening, the runway lights of Cedar Hollow glowing not because of any emergency, but simply because the airfield itself had come back to life. Griffin stood near the hangar entrance while Sloane remained a respectful distance away, the moment carrying no need for grand declarations, only a quiet, earned sense of mutual respect. Rees visited Cedar Hollow that same week, no longer as a pilot navigating an emergency but simply as a friend who understood, better than most, exactly what Griffin had accomplished in the middle of that storm. The two men walked the length of the runway together, Rees pointing out small details he had noticed from the cockpit that night. The precision of the lighting intervals, the clean edge of the surface even in the downpour, the calm cadence of Griffin's voice over a radio that never once wavered under pressure. He told Griffin that in all his years of flying, he had rarely worked with a ground controller so steady under conditions that had rattled far more experienced airports, and Griffin, uncomfortable with praise, simply shrugged and said he had spent enough nights imagining exactly that scenario to know what needed to happen when it finally arrived. Word of the exchange eventually reached the Regional Aviation Authority, which opened its own review of Cedar Hollow's history and formally reaffirmed its status as a protected emergency landing site, closing the door on any future attempt to dismiss its value on paper. Mara, watching her father receive commendation letters he barely glanced at before filing them away in the same cabinet as his father's old logbooks, began to understand for the first time exactly why he had never once considered giving up the fight, even when giving up would have been so much easier than holding on. It closed with the simple truth that a man who had once been dismissed by an entire town never needed revenge or bitter words to prove his worth. He only needed to protect what mattered long enough for the rest of the world to finally understand it.
Do you think? Oh! Oh, I'm a dummy, I'm a dummy, I'm a dummy, I'm a dummy! I wasted it completely! What's up, Jacksonus? How you doing? There you go. Oh my god, I could have had so much damage on him already if I got that skull off. Holy shit. Oh, you're so lucky. You're so lucky for that. Of course. Golly. God damn, let me let up for 1 second, bro. Oh wait, I could do something. Son of a bitch. Ha! Let's go.
You have forced my...
Jackson, this he's fast. Be patient. He's got 2 fights. Oh shit. I'll find out. Oh fuck.